Hey everyone, this is Raymond, your co-host on the Front Porch Philosophers Podcast. Thanks for listening to today's episode. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and follow us on Twitter at Philosophy Porch for live updates about future content. You can check us out on YouTube, Spotify, iTunes, and Google Play. You can also become a founding member of our podcast by going to patreon.com/fpphilosophers, where you can support our show, get access to our blog, and learn more about the host of the Front Porch Philosophers Podcast. Thanks for listening.
And we're live back. This is Front Porch Philosophers Podcast. I'm your host, Thomas Jared Farmer, joined as always by my cohort, Raymond Perrier and Michael
Howdy.
Donato.
What up?
This is going to be
Howdy.
part two of our conversation on, what's the conversation on? Truth?
Yeah, something like that.
So last couple of things. So last time I was having some technical difficulties. I had to drop out of the conversation, so we're going to be continuing that. But before we get back into where we left off, I do want to make a correction over something that I said last time. I was caught a little bit off guard by a question that Michael had issued regarding Matthew's gospel. Well, it's actually about John's gospel, but I made a comment about Matthew's gospel.
Keep him on his toes.
What I had meant to say was that in Matthew's gospel, all of the different characters refer to Jesus as rabbi, as teacher, except for his disciples. They refer to him as Lord, as kurios, except at the Last Supper scene, whenever Jesus lets the disciples know that one of them is going to betray him, they go around the table and each one asks, "Is it I, Lord? Is it I, Lord? Is it I, Lord?" But when it comes to Judas Iscariot, he says, "Is it I, Rabbi?" Or is it I, teacher? And then, of course, at the Garden of Gethsemane, when Judas shows up with the temple guards to betray Jesus, he says, "Hail, Rabbi," kisses him on the cheek to let them know that that is Jesus. And so this is kind of a distancing mechanism for the author of Matthew's gospel to kind of place Judas outside of the circle of believers. So, that's just a little correction on my part. Again, this is all extemporaneous. I mean,
just covering your bases for those religious scholars that are going to come after you.
Yeah, I know. Well, I mean, the thing is, we don't prepare, aside from talking about what topics we're going to go over and some basic materials that we want to hit. I mean, we don't prepare these like lectures. I mean, obviously, we would be much more rigorous if we were going to be giving a lecture. But when we do make mistakes, as is almost always going to happen in any kind of loose conversation, I think it's important that we go back and note places where we may have been mistaken, or if we were just unclear about what we meant, that we take the opportunity to clarify those. So, without further ado,
Michael doesn't make mistakes, though.
I don't.
Well, aside from Mike,
No worries from him.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I don't have anything to add
Actually,
to
my
that.
entire life has been one big mistake.
Okay. Well, with that segue,
Such a nihilist.
Raymond, you were saying some stuff apparently at the end of the last episode, and I gratefully didn't have to endure listening to it at that time. But now, if you would be so happy as to recap what you were saying, for me to get back up to speed.
All right. Well, I think the gist of it was basically just that Jared and Michael were wrong and I'm correct. And we'll leave it at that.
That's the gist of all your comments, isn't it?
Basically.
Yeah.
No. So I was pushing the conversation on the question of absolute truth, which, given the scope of how we were talking about truth in the previous episode, we started off talking about, probability as being a major component there. Going back to the facts and opinions episode we did, a couple of weeks back. So I wanted to push to a less empirical form of truth, which is, the a priori, the absolute kind of truth that inherently comes up, whether you agree that it's a substantial ground for, making a truth claim, and attaching that sort of qualifier or predicate absolute to the end of it. That's debatable, I understand, but people do it anyway. So I thought we need to talk about it, and especially in religion. So I think where we ended was basically me rambling on about the nature of absolute and the relative, and how within a relative sphere of truth there are absolute truths that can exist, that don't necessarily negate, or come into contact with other absolute truths, because they're basically contained within this relative sphere of language games, of meaning making, so forth and so on. And that in order to essentially move, um, somebody's understanding of truth, you know, beyond itself, you have to have those interactions or those encounters with other spheres of truth making to really kind of thrust you out of your own sphere. So I think I was really just trying to come up with a way of talking about, absolute truth and how it could fit into the conversation without it
Yeah.
being demonized, or pushed back on, or completely just neglected.
And I think I was struggling to understand what the hell you were saying. So,
Yeah, me too.
yeah. Well, like the the I like the second part, the second segment of what you were just saying there, in terms of talking about, if we want to talk about different areas of truth, or different types of truth, or different sorts of language games. If we want to start like demarcating between different subjects and different realms of human experience, or however you want to phrase
Yeah,
that. But the distinction between absolute and relative truth, that's kind of what I was asking about, or at least what I was trying to ask about, in terms of like, okay, like if we're going to accept some sort of framework for truth, I mean, it just gets back to the basic definitions that we were talking about last time. Like, okay, well then tell me, like, what exactly are you referring to when you're talking about absolute and relative truth within the context of what you were just saying?
It seems almost like the distinction between the primary and secondary properties, right? It's like, yeah, you can make a distinction between those, but ultimately they're kind of dependent on the same thing. Or maybe that's a stretch. I don't know.
And they don't really matter, but
yeah. They're certainly conditioning. They're mutually conditioning. Well, an absolute truth, I think, if it's going to be connected to something, we used the word a priori in the last episode,
yeah,
uh, and in a defense of trying to talk about absolute truths, which a priori basically just means that the standard criteria for determining whether or not something true has nothing to do with physical entities or
okay,
objects in the
okay,
world. It's a question of logic or mathematics, or um, just pure rationality. Uh, and so, insofar as that is true, the debate has always been, well, then how is this nothing more than just speculative thinking? Um, just imagination, right? Working out weird connections between concepts that don't necessarily have any external
yeah.
validity, and ergo are not, truthful at all, because it's just what you think is going on. There's no proof.
So can we camp out a little bit there?
Sure.
Can we kind of like unpack that some?
Yeah.
I would like to anyway, because I'd like to hear what both of you would have to say about a priori truth, right?
Well, my understanding of a priori truth as a contradistinction from a posteriori truth, right? So a posteriori
Yeah,
is,
why don't you explain that? Yeah,
okay, so a priori just means prior to experience, and a posteriori means after experience, right? So the way that I typically tell this to students is just think, I mean, if you're having trouble with these concepts, I mean, if you're unfamiliar with them as an audience member, just think that a priori has prior in it, so prior to experience, and a posteriori has post in it, so post experience. The distinction between those two things is the sorts of truths that you can know apart from experience, at least the ones that are traditionally said to be a priori, would be things like mathematical truths by definition.
yeah.
So things which are true by definition would be like, all bachelors are unmarried men. Of course, that's what it means because that's just what the word means. So you can change the definition of a word, but ultimately, as long as you're operating within the same language game, then you have to say that definitional truths are not really debatable. Same thing with mathematics. The other thing about mathematics is you can't justify mathematics without an assumption of its validity. It's like one of the underpinnings of logic. It's true because it has to be true, because there's not really grounds for questioning its truth, and you lose a lot by questioning it. So maybe there's no ultimate justification for something like mathematics, but one, how would you know that would be the case? And if it were the case, you would have to scrap a whole lot.
Yeah.
The problem with a priori stuff is that, the truths of mathematics, and the truths by definition, they don't really inform you about a lot of things, right? So the experience of the world and basically anything that would require empirical justification are off the table with a priori truths. You can know that they are the case, but they're uninteresting truths. A posteriori is based upon probability. And so this basically would be anything dictated by science, right? The sort of things that you can, at least in theory, go and investigate. So, for example, there are some things which are, you can't investigate practically, and there's some things that you can't investigate in principle. So if there's a teapot currently orbiting Jupiter, right, I can't investigate that because it would be practically difficult. But it's not in principle difficult to establish. I mean, it's not in principle impossible to establish.
Yeah, sorry. Let me interject real quick, and then you and Raymond can get right back at it. So, to me, what makes this interesting is I think that there's a deeper layer to this. Jared, I think you did an excellent job about describing the basic differences. Now, some philosophers, though, take that difference and will run with it one way or another. And so, like, if we take this distinction between a priori or posteriori, put it within the context of capital T truth that we're talking about, I think I would ask, like, well, what are a priori truths capital T true? Does the existence of a priori truth point to some sort of truth that is not empirical? Because philosophers within the Platonic tradition would say that this is why a priori truths are true, because they're founded in and they have their ontology in some world outside of ours, right? Or they exist. They're true regardless of experience. They're true whether or not we've had the experience of them, and they'll always be true, right? So, what do you guys, to turn it back to you, what do you guys think about that, and how would you dissect that sort of approach?
I think that's a meaningless way of talking about it personally. The a priori truth, as Jared said, would be 100% uninteresting unless, it wasn't for the fact that it's used in a practical way, which is, very common in philosophy, especially, people who follow from Kant. Um, a priori truths, have real no don't have much value, it seems, unless you allow for the possibility that some a priori truth helps shape and form the way a person acts in more concrete, practical circumstances.
Okay.
So, if you were to make an argument and then develop a concept around an a priori understanding of, a religious entity like God, then typically that religious entity would have some moral and practical impact on your life and the way that you lead your existence. And that's where I think they become interesting, because they tend to shape the way that people
Okay.
see themselves as themselves purely, and then simply in and amongst other people and other selves and other in the world. It kind of guides their way of life.
Right.
Well, for myself, I mean, I see this in pragmatic terms, right? So whether or not, something like a Platonic, some kind of Platonic foundation exists in another world, right? That there's some truth which is absolute apart from our experience of the world, and such that our experiences are kind of passing. They're passingly true insofar as we can relate them to some external referent, be that the world in its totality or some other world. I mean, obviously, all of this is difficult to establish. I think that the category of truth, though, has pragmatic value. And my concern in a lot of contemporary discourses over the nature of truth is that if we overly relativize distinctions between what's true and false, what is the case and what is not the case, if you kind of take a nihilist bend towards these things, then you can make no contradistinction between facticity and bullshit,
Yeah.
right? And my concern is that a lot of this dialogue, and not at the level of academic philosophers, but in public discourse, I think a lot of this has become weaponized, right?
Yeah.
Where people start talking
Yeah,
about there
absolutely.
is no truth, right?
Right.
Or truth is what you
Mhm.
make it, and I can bend the world to my own opinion
Yeah.
about things. And,
Yeah.
who are you to question my conception of reality? You don't know. And so at a practical level, this is where I find this stuff really problematic, right?
Yeah.
So I obviously understand the arguments for questioning categories like absolute truth, and obviously there's a very long tradition of seeing whether or not these Platonic concepts have any real import into the world. But at the end of the day, if you don't have some kind of ideal like absolute truth to it kind of it's the means by which you right the ship, right?
Yeah.
You're aiming towards absolute truth, and even if you know that you can't get there, then it at least gives you some kind of direction. If you'll permit me, one analogy.
Just one.
I think that a lot of the discourses that you find where people say, well, what is truth, or truth is not a thing, or, truth is what you make it, those sorts of things. I ask, well, if we see truth as an ideal that we aim towards, if we compare it to another ideal that we know is ultimately unobtainable, something like justice, right?
Yeah.
So we all know that justice, full, complete justice in the physical world is unattainable. But what you do is you seek after justice while knowing that it's always going to be imperfect at best. But if you were to take a kind of relativizing, nihilistic, or cynical approach to justice, you would have to just say, well, I give up. If we can't have complete justice in the world, then what are we doing? And why should we even be seeking after it? Well, because if you don't seek after it, while knowing it's unattainable, what kind of world would we be living in? I think truth is the same way, right? You know that you're never going to get at the absolute truth. You know that the absolute truth, if it exists, is unobtainable. But that concept is practically useful because if you give up on it on cynical, nihilistic grounds, then it puts you in a very difficult place to live in the world practically.
Yeah. I bring up this distinction of, and I wanted to talk about this distinction between a priori and a posteriori, just because it's something that I deal with quite a bit in my readings in the history of science, and I think at this point and on this subject, science and scientists and the philosophy of science really has a lot of cross sections there, because it's almost. And, people think, well, like Platonism, no one's really a Platonist anymore, that sort of thing. But there is a sort of mathematical Platonism that's been latent in science ever since the scientific revolution that kind of like rears its head every now and then. I mean, you see it start in the scientific revolution with Copernicus, right? Copernicus believed, even though he had no way to prove it experimentally or empirically, Copernicus believed that his mathematical equations were true, right? And if you were to ask him, well, what do you mean they're true, right? His response would have been, well, they're physically true. This is the physical shape of the universe, even though there was no way to empirically verify any of that. The same with Kepler and with Galileo. Galileo famously in the Essayer says that the universe is written in the language of mathematics, written by that the universe has basically been coded by God using mathematics. So mathematics has the sort of independent ontology that exists outside of the world. And this is and it's really, really difficult to kind of to parse through this, because a lot of contemporary physics and contemporary science is some people just sort of assume it, and it kind of crops up in discussions about the existence of certain entities in physics, especially in like quantum mechanics, or if you're dealing with issues of like cosmology, where a lot of these ideas have mathematical support but haven't been empirically verified. So it's an interesting question, and it's one that I don't have a great answer to, but I think that on that point, philosophy definitely has made some ground and can really help us sort of understand like what exactly is being talked about here.
Yeah, I mean, you hear that among physicists, or at least the physicists that I've talked to. They'll say things like, "Well," so if you question something like string theory, for example, they'll say, "Well, the
Yeah.
math dictates it, right? So the math dictates all these dimensions."
Yeah.
Well, if you can't verify it empirically, then you are relying upon some presumption about the operation of mathematics. Maybe that's justifiable. Maybe it's not. I don't know. I'm not a mathematician or a physicist, but it does, as you say,
Right.
rely upon some kind of innate confidence in abstract mathematics, which,
Yeah, because mathematics is taken to be a priori true,
yeah,
capital T true.
yeah,
It has some good ground, though. I mean, there's definitely some reinforcement to support the, efficacy of mathematics based off of its usefulness in, engineering and
well, I don't
biology and
think
It's
all
super
kinds of
effective.
practical
I don't
sciences.
think
So,
that any of us are
well, and
questioning
I'm
it.
just saying
Yeah,
that
I don't think any
Yeah.
of us are.
practical
Yeah,
experience reinforces its use at such a theoretical level to suggest that at some
Yeah.
point somebody will discover empirical evidence to support to back it up. So
that's a presumption, though.
But you see similar arguments in philosophy with appeals to logic,
Yeah,
right? To the rules of logic and the laws of logic. Like, well, this must be true because the law of non-contradiction.
yeah,
Or if
yeah,
I can reduce your argument to some sort of logical fallacy, then you're just flat wrong,
yeah.
right? That's the same sort of. I mean, I think they're doing the same sort of move there. It seems like it anyway.
Well,
yeah, maybe.
the problem, a couple of things. I mean, non-contradiction, though, seems to be violated in quantum mechanics, right? So
Oh
that's
yeah,
so
yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
it's kind of like, well, is you're violating logic? Well, but it makes sense with math. Well, math and logic are kind of taken to be, hand in glove, right? So how do you justify
yeah.
that? I don't know. This is maybe we should find a physicist and talk to them about it, and they could clarify this.
Well, you have the similar thing in mathematics with indeterminacy that not all mathematical proofs can be justified.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
yeah, yeah.
anyway,
Now, the thing with regards to logical contradictions, I mean, you can you can construct construct syllogisms, right? To say a lot of different things. There's a difference between making something valid and making something sound, right? Because to have a sound argument means that you have a valid argument,
Yeah,
which is
yeah,
also incidentally true. And so, how could you ever establish something beyond validity, right? To also say it is sound, because it
yeah,
presumes that you know something additional about the statements involved. I mean, so much of logic is bound up with language, and language itself is inherently problematic
yeah.
for a number of different reasons.
Well, and I think,
So let me
go ahead, Mike.
go ahead, Raymond. I want to throw a question back
I was
at
just
y'all,
going to
but
say that
you go ahead.
the stepping beyond validity would be to move towards modality, which would include something necessary. It's not just valid, but it's necessary.
Oh yeah,
And that's
yeah,
where the absolute truths begin to really show their colors, and where you begin to i- and this is where I get back to the moral and practical implications of truth, and how the a priori is meaningful and useful, and something you need to discuss because of its implications is the necessity of absolute truth. When somebody says that God exists and they think of it in a necessary way, and in an absolute way, that
yeah,
means that everybody who doesn't think that is either
yeah.
irrational or condemned by God. And that's the kind of crap you have to deal with. That
Right.
is the purpose for us having to parse through all of this.
Well, let me. So that's kind of gets to the question I wanted to throw at you and Jared, because y'all have done a lot more reading the philosophy of religion than I have. So, like, take this conversation that we're talking about, in whichever way you see fit. We're talking about, capital T truth. You can bring in a priori or posteriori truth if you want to. But so what I'm curious about is how this applies to religion, or how does this apply to religious truth? Like, is religious truth something different or distinct, or would you basically talk about it in the same way that we've been talking about it?
Yes and no, right? As a way to equivocate on all of this. Here's the thing. I think that the issue with regards to religious language is that religious language is of a specific kind, right? It's a specific kind of meaning making. I don't know that makes it distinct from a distinct form of truth necessarily. I think it's a distinct way of talking about the world, which is informed by a lot of different things. And so kind of mythopoetic language is a way of talking about the ineffable, because ultimately the long tradition, right? So obviously we can all find, rather obtuse cases of contemporary, even theologians, talking about God in really anthropomorphic terms. But I think the long tradition, especially within the great monotheistic religions, has been to say that God is so radically other. The presumption is that there's a necessary entity. You can't even really call it a being. There's something so radically other,
Right.
which is the ground of being. It's the necessary thing which allows for the category of being to exist. It's so radically other that you can't meaningfully say anything about it, because human language is incapable of talking about it except by analogy, right? At least this is the way in which someone like Thomas Aquinas would make the case, right? So you have to take either the apophatic route, which is to say that you can't say what God is, all you can say is what God is not, or you can speak of God through the analogia entis, the analogy of a being. So God is like such and such. But ultimately, human language will always break down, and the only acceptable response in the face of the ineffable, once language breaks down, is silence. Silence in the face of a mystery is kind of the presumption. But if we are to speak of this necessary entity, whatever you want to call it, even then, like entity, it utilizes this notion of being, because it comes back to entis, right? So we can't. Human language is just incapable of dealing with it.
Escape our
So,
language.
because if you talk about a necessary being, then that's utilizing being language, right? Which is problematic, at least for traditional theologians. God is not a being. God is the whatever that allows for the possibility of being.
The whence.
Yeah, the whence and whither.
Yep.
Jump in there, Raymond. I want to hear what you have to say.
I was just gonna. I think Jared's on point, and the thing I'm gonna add is gonna get back to the presupposition that underlies the question, which is that truth demands a hierarchy. And I think that
Okay.
insofar as people want to push a hierarchical understanding of truth, where, say, for example, like you were asking, or I'm presuming religious truth would have some special position, maybe distinct or isolated from other kinds of truth. That kind of distinction, uh, I think, can be dangerous insofar as it allows somebody then to set up some standard of excluding people, or setting up some sort of hierarchy where the truth of religion becomes more substantial and meaningful than, like the truth of science or of politics or of whatever.
Yeah.
And insofar as that's the case, I think I don't like that starting point, because I think it presupposes a certain just a traditional way of looking at truth as being in a hierarchy of being, where there are better and worse truths. And
Uh,
historically that's been used to alienate people too, uh, to say that you haven't ascended to the rigors of intellect or whatever that we have because you don't understand this or that, or you don't believe this or that, so you're
Yeah.
inferior or whatever. So that's what I would say to that.
So is the question of truth then even connected? Like, can we even talk about religious truth? Because it sounds like, from what you guys were saying, that we really
Absolutely,
can't.
absolutely.
Truth in what
I think we
sense?
can to some extent. It would be in the same sense as other things, insofar as truth um, is a way of expressing one's rationality in language, which then is used to communicate, to create bonds, to determine one's life, the actions that they take, and things like that. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, if I can make the distinction again, I think this comes down to not a distinction over truth necessarily, as if truth are two different things, like religious truth and the truths of science. Say, I think that the way that is most helpful for me to think about this distinction is to say that science aims for a kind of univocal truth, whereas religious language is more polyvalent. And let me use two traditional terms to make the
And you
distinction.
got to explain all
So
that too.
that's what I'm trying to do.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the next move. Um, so so if you make the distinction between scientia, which is like knowing, and mythos, right, which is storytelling, right?
hmm
I think that religious language is much more close to is much more close to storytelling. Now, the thing about storytelling is it necessarily involves interpretation, and you can have many different interpretations of a singular story, and in that way, a story is polyvalent, right? So different people can derive different meanings from a singular story, and you can continually, if it's a good story,
Yeah.
you can continually mine a story for new meanings, and you can apply it into new contexts. It's the reason why people continue to read classical literature. It's the reason why people continue to find meaning in the myths, in Greco-Roman myths, in traditional religious stories, is because you can always see them in a new context. So, for example, there was a great article written by the Catholic intellectual Gary Wills several years ago, talking. I think um, it was after a school shooting, where he talks about he compares the United States affection for guns to the god Molech in the Old Testament, which was a god that required the sacrifice of children,
Uh-huh.
and it was a powerful image that he utilized. Now, it wasn't as if the people who were writing about Molech and whatever it was, the 8th century BCE, had any kind of inkling that that story was going to be used for something like 21st century debates over firearms. But the continual resonance of the story allows for a new interpretation. You can continually reinterpret these stories over and over and over again because this is a component of human existence, right? We tell stories, and those stories can be interpreted in new contexts because there are things which are new about human experience, and then there are things which are always resonant because human beings are the same in new situations. And so we can find resonance in ancient stories. It's like having a conversation with the past. And I don't think that the truths of mathematics or the truths of science are in the same business, right? It's not that they're contrary. It's just that one is about experience and then one is about knowledge. And I don't know that those are the same things. But
Oh
what I
man.
mean by saying that I don't want to pit no, I don't want to pit science and religion against each other, because I don't think that truth, but this is kind of the basis of this entire conversation, right? Is truth the same thing as facticity? Well, I don't know. All right. So
Well,
at the beginning of this rant, I was saying that I don't think these are distinct things, but by the end, it sounds like
well,
they
let
do.
me
Yeah,
push
I
back.
would say that they have to be.
Let me push back a little bit on it, and then you and Raymond can and jump in and perhaps clarify because this is kind of hard for me to wrap my head around. So it seems to me that you're saying that religious truth, if you want to call it that or not call it that or whatever,
I
that
don't, but
religious truth is somehow equated to meaning. That the truth of a particular story is how meaningful or how not meaningful that story is to the individual, right? But
yes.
Yeah.
if you're in like for the common everyday person on the street, if I give them the story of Pinocchio and I say,
Hmm.
"Is this true?" they would say, "No," right? Because when I ask, "Is this true?" what I'm asking is this real? Right? So go for it. Like, okay, you have
Well, if
whatever
if
story you
it's
want to
not,
pick.
well, okay. First, I don't know that Joe on the street is it should be the standard for
No,
anything,
I'm just saying that
but
for you to clarify what you're talking
yeah.
about here.
No, I think that if you were to push back again, so typically when people say truth, what they mean is facticity. I think that we've more or less established that. The average person, when they think what is true, they think what is factual. Did this happen?
Yeah.
You know, did Joshua in the book of Joshua? Did God stop the earth from spinning so that the day would be prolonged so that Joshua could win a battle? Did that factually
Stop the
happen?
sun,
No,
right?
of course it. Or sun,
Commands the sun. Yeah.
well, how
Yeah.
Because it's a
he prolonged the
geocentric
day.
universe back then.
The point is,
Because it's false.
did that physically happen? No, of course not. But you have to understand what's happening in the context of a story, right?
Uh-huh.
Because anything can happen in the context of a story. What's important is not
Is it meant to be a
did
story
this.
though,
Yeah, because I mean,
or is it meant to be history?
I would say it's not meant to be history, or at least the idea of history was not a firmly established idea yet. So I mean, you would, if you
Of
compare it to
our
something.
understanding of history, yeah.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's anachronistic to go back and look at those stories as it. Obviously, there are some
But
historical
they thought it
elements.
really happened, right?
Probably. I mean, it depends on the person.
Assuming that the text you're reading isn't recounting stories and epics from, past or whatever, and if they're actually just telling events in a straightforward way, there's a lot of assumptions built in the question. They thought it was true, right?
Mm-hmm.
Did Homer think that Achilles was actually the son of a god? I mean, I don't
A
know.
lot of Greeks did.
I mean, a lot of Greeks did, but a lot of contemporary Americans think that the Earth is flat.
Right.
What I think that when we're reading stories, right? I think it's kind of a fool's errand to say, well, what did the original audience interpretation of this look like? Because that's hard to determine, right? It's hard to determine the motivations of an author. I think it's
Yeah.
even more difficult to determine how something is received unless we have actual evidence of this is the way in which it was read, this is the way in which it was intended to be read. I think that it is anachronistic to apply contemporary historical standards to any ancient work, whether it's Herodotus or Homer
Sure.
or the works of ancient Israel.
But I would say so. All right. This is the deal here, right? The reason why you're saying that, and the reason why we believe that, is because of the scientific revolution and the scientific standard of truth. Specifically speaking, within the revolution that sort of happened in history during the Enlightenment, right? Because ancient people believed that the world was inundated with God or gods, and that these things actually happened. We no longer think that because of what happened during their Enlightenment. So, like, what does religious truth mean nowadays, if it means anything anymore?
I would like to point out two things, though. The first one is that a great deal of archaeological research has determined that there are certainly aspects of ancient texts, whether it's the Bible or other kinds of texts, that do bear truth, right?
Sure.
Not, and I'm just pointing that out because we haven't talked about that. Also, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all aspects and every line of the Bible or any other text that you could name of ancient times could be analyzed from a scientific perspective or deemed truth thereby in the scientific way,
Hmm.
whether it's archaeological, historical, classical studies, whatever it be. Then the other thing um, would just be to to say that there are definitely uh, groups of linguists, linguist, linguistic anthropologists, or just philosophers of language, who would also say we don't know for a fact that they believe that these things were true in the way that we think they believe them.
Right.
Um, so there's an assumption that okay, you send a goat or a lamb off and with all of the burdens and sins of the village on its back in the form of sticks, and that actually takes the evil away. That's just a way of talking about something, using a language to get at something that they didn't have other terms for. It doesn't necessarily mean that they literally believe that. That's it. So, and we just don't know. They could have. But there are a lot of linguists and philosophers of language that would argue that maybe that's not true, that they perfectly knew that these ceremonies were more metaphorical, or whatever the term would be, than actually true in the way that we would talk about it in scientific terms.
Yeah,
Well,
absolutely.
I would give a couple of examples here. All right. So for example, take Philo Judaeus, for example, Philo of Alexandria. By the first century, it was common practice among pagan philosophers to go back and read the Homeric tales as being analogies, right?
Yeah.
That these are stories which are really about like human existence. So this very much antedates the scientific revolution. I think the tendency of a lot of scientists is to say that basically myths are failed science. They're basically failed science, right? And I don't think that was the primary reason why any of these existed. Not only that,
But it
if
is
you look
a
at
reason,
Philo,
right?
it may be a reason, but that's presuming a univocal interpretation of a particular audience. So Philo talked about. Way to think about it. So Philo talked about essentially average everyday people actually believe, that Zeus comes down,
Right.
fornicates with women, produces, demigods and whatnot. But that, we enlightened people realize that these are just stories,
Yeah.
right? And these are stories that have specific meanings. And he does the same thing with the works of the Hebrew Bible, right? He says, no one actually obviously I'm paraphrasing, no one actually believes things like the Joshua story, right? No one actually believes that there was a worldwide flood. Now, when he says nobody, what he means is no cultured intellectuals of the first century believed that.
Uh-huh.
Just like today, if Raymond and I are saying, well, no one thinks that, what we mean is that no one who has had requisite training or experience thinks that. But I mean, there are people, you can say just as well, there's a kind of chronological snobbery, I think, which is built in the way that we talk about the history of science, where people say, well,
What?
yeah, chronological snobbery,
Huh?
where people think that people in antiquity were somehow radically different than people of today, that we are graced with the
They are.
scientific method in a way that, I mean, there's been some degree of progress, but people are basically the
They don't
same.
know a
And there's
fraction of
always
what we
been,
know. So of course they're different than us.
not different people, we have different amounts of information.
They have a completely different way of viewing the world, though.
Yeah, but I mean, you could say that about all peoples and all times and all societies, right? So a contemporary person living in Papua New Guinea likely has a very different worldview than you. I mean, the problem is
Right.
that we make
He's
this.
probably closer to the ancients.
Yeah.
That's a presumption, isn't it?
Yeah, but I mean, I think it's a presumption based on good evidence because he doesn't have
What evidence?
the modern knowledge of everything that's happened over the past 300-400 years.
Neither does the average American. Do they?
Well, I would say that the other issue with the historical, discussion is simply that in ancient the uh, the information we have from ancient times comes from very, very, very small resources.
Right.
So just because Aristotle and Plato believe something, does that mean that, everybody believed that? Hell, for all we know, they were the worst philosophers of ancient Greece. And the only reason
Yeah.
we, valorize them is because they're some of the only, extensive works that we have left over from that time period. So,
No, I understand,
and
and
that's
I'm
just me
I'm
playing the devil's
not
advocate here, saying that where you can't
right.
you can't take these conversations to too far an extreme, because then you start running into all kinds of methodological issues.
Yeah, but like I get what you guys are saying, and I agree to it. Of course, I mean historically, but at the same time, I mean, yeah, but all the evidence we do have points to the fact that the ancient people understood the world in a radically different way than we did. How they interpreted the myths, we may not know. Did they interpret it as myth as we understand it? Maybe, maybe not. But in their cosmologies that they created, like, did they actually believe that their cosmologies apply to reality? I don't see why not. Like, why is that such a big leap to assume?
Yeah, I think it's, a commonsensical uh, thing to say. I just wanted to let it be known to the audience that there are definitely reputable scholars out there who question the validity of
Sure.
our assumption that they believed the way that we think they believed. Um,
Right.
but the real question is getting back to your religious study or your religious truth question,
Yeah.
which is
Please.
I just want to say that I think that there is religious truth, um, for people out there. And I don't think it's I mean, I think you could say the same thing of somebody who is not religious, who has found some kind of truth or absolute truth, or, whatever truth in their life through uh, other means, that are not religious. I just think that religious truth is one way of, uh, you know, creating, um, clarity amongst many different kinds of truth that I think stand on, equal shares of validity.
Yeah, I guess I'm just having a hard time conceptualizing that. So give me an example of what would be a religious truth.
So yeah, I think the belief in a higher power, or some underlying, so we could say a statement, a truth statement from religion would be that God created the world, right? Um, and that as a result, that truth statement has a power over the individual to think of themselves as being created, which makes them creatures. And then as a result of that, they think of the world itself as being created. And insofar as it was created by that which they worship, it demands some sort of dignity and respect that would prompt them to live in it in a certain way, treat it in a certain way, that kind of thing. That would be a sort of like web of,
So how is that not a failed
because
cosmology?
it doesn't necessarily have to speak about the empirical uh, verification of how things came into existence to have a narrative of life that orients your action in a daily basis. They're not contradicting, because I don't necessarily think they don't necessarily make the same claims about existence.
Well, I guess that would depend on what you mean by created then.
Yeah.
It comes well. Here's the problem. I think for a lot of this, I think that religion is a collective enterprise insofar as individuals come together to form communities of belief. But ultimately, what one person within a religious group thinks is going to be different than what another person thinks in that same religious group. They've come together to for collective practice. So I think it's a bit.
Right.
I think it blurs the lines too much to talk about. Well, what do religious people think? I mean, as if a majority of the human beings which have ever lived, who presumably would have identified themselves as being religious, at least up to the point where religion was even a category to be identified, that they somehow share some collective understanding. Well, yes and no. It depends. I mean, what a learned theologian in a particular religious tradition thinks versus a co-religionist with no background whatsoever in that same religion. They both identify as Christian or Jewish, what have you, but their conceptions of the world could be radically different. You know, if you have a religious person who is also a physicist, their idea about creation is going to be different than a religious person who has no background in the physical sciences. And so I think that it's too imprecise, I think, to talk about religious conceptions of the world versus scientific conceptions of the world. I think that wholesale presumes a lot about an overall conception of life for the religious person versus the scientific person, and it automatically pits them against each other, as if there aren't scientifically religious people. And that's just, I think that the parameters of the conversation are problematic because I don't think that we can speak univocally of the scientific community. I don't think we can speak univocally, certainly, of the religious community. And to talk about them separately is to presume that they are somehow antagonistic.
No, but you can talk about it in terms of the scientific approach to understanding reality, right? Which is, insofar as it is inherently naturalistic, is somewhat antagonistic to religious belief, however you want to define that.
You can also say that religious truth is not necessarily speaking to reality at all, but is speaking to purpose in
Experience.
life, to existential questions that go beyond the scope of scientific explanation, things like that. I think.
Right. So we do have two categories of truth then.
No, they're both truth. They're just different ways of approaching human existence.
Well, all right, I'll give an example, and maybe this is not a good example, but it's an example that comes to mind. So John Polkinghorne, who is both a physicist and I think he's an ordained minister, he's at least a religious individual. He's a religious individual whose day job is to be a physicist. He specializes in quantum mechanics. He made the distinction about ways of describing an event. So if you ask the question, why is the water boiling? Right? He says, well, and then he gives an extensive scientific explanation about what is happening physically, right, to make water boil. It reaches a certain temperature, and at a certain temperature, these chemical reactions occur, yada, yada, yada. He said it's also equally true, and it's perfectly acceptable to answer the question, why is the water boiling, to say, because I wanted tea, right? It's two different ways of explaining the same event. Now, one of these has to do with individual human motivations, right? And one of them is a physical description of the world. Now, you need not rely on either of those, right? You could just give one answer, but a more complete answer would necessarily involve both. Which
you can't explain human motivation using a physical description of the world?
You can. But I don't think that those are, they're different language games. But see, this is the thing. I don't think that they're two different kinds of truth. They're two different ways of explaining the world. The world is the way the world is. And we as human beings have come up with specific language games to describe our experience of the world. One of them is just very precise in its physical regularities, let's say, and the other is it's not the purpose. I don't think that they're the I don't think that they're the same because I don't think they're attempting to describe the same things.
Uh, Seems to me like they are. I guess this is where this whole issue boils down to. Yeah, they're doing it in different ways, and yeah, you can frame it in different sorts of questions, but ultimately, I mean, and maybe we have to save this for another discussion because I think we're reaching the hour mark here.
Well, let me pose a question for you then, Michael, real quickly,
Sure.
and see. So since you've been asking a lot of questions of the religious scholars here, um, so does scientific theories, scientific methods, to the scientific truths make any of these kinds of claims? Do they make uh, moral claims about the world? Do they make ethical claims about the world? Do they even make historical claims about the world? Do they make metaphysical claims? Do they make, a priori claims? Those kinds of things. Some of those we can certainly say, yes, we've already discussed to some
Right.
extent. And insofar as that's true, then I think it is a question as to whether or not there is a difference between religious truth and scientific truth.
Right.
Though I doubt a scientist would want to say that. I think that, metaphysical speculation is metaphysical speculation, whether it's done mathematically and in cases of dealing with matter and energy, or,
Right.
speculation about the way that God exists. It's still speculative. Um, but then we still have the other categories of the moral and the
Yeah.
ethical. Does science, does physics, does the naturalist sciences make claims about those things?
I mean, first, I would want to make a point, and I could be mistaken about who said this, but I believe off the top of my head, I believe it was Dan Dennett who said that there's no such thing as philosophy-free science. And it's an excellent point because science, especially if you're looking at science from a historical perspective, science doesn't occur within a vacuum.
Yeah, yeah,
There's all these sorts of political, social, and even philosophical pressures influencing what scientists say and how they talk about things. So, in that sense, right, if we're talking about science within a historical sense, then yes, I think there are certainly philosophical implications of scientific ideas, and that certain scientific ideas favor certain philosophical
hmm,
positions, right? You can see this in the career of Einstein. Einstein's a tricky example because he often fluctuates back and forth between being a realist and anti-realist, believing that his mathematical theories are true, absolute capital T, truth, that it describes reality, truth, and just saying that this is a convenient way of
yeah,
talking about it. But regardless of that, Einstein's idea did have does have metaphysical implications concerning time,
hmm,
for example.
yeah,
Absolutely. Research into we talked about vaccines. Research into vaccines certainly has moral implications.
hmm,
Should you or should you not vaccinate your child? Well, science is going to play a big part in that in answering that question, right? Can it give us general ethical principles? No. On the other hand, right, to present a rebuttal to my own self, right, if you look at the Manhattan Project and you look at the scientists involved with the Manhattan Project, should we or should we not pursue this? Should we build this bomb?
yeah,
At first, people like Szilard, Oppenheimer, the question, the answer was yes, of course. Why? Because if we don't, the Germans are going to build it. But then, when it came time to actually use the bomb, a lot of them backed out. And in fact, a lot of the scientists who are
yeah,
working on the project said, "Well, maybe we shouldn't do this." But so in that case,
yeah,
science was sort of morally neutral, morally gray, right?
yeah,
There's no clear position that you could gather from atomic physics that tells you whether or not you should build an atomic bomb in the first place. That's just
yeah,
that's morally neutral. But so I would say that yes and no, and I see what you're getting at. Does science have something to say about history? Again, like history proper, no, because history is does not operate. The discipline of history doesn't operate according to the scientific method. Can science inform
yeah.
history? Absolutely. right? Science can
Yes,
tell us all
absolutely.
kind of stuff about history, especially ancient
Yeah.
history, in which we don't always have like primary sources, right? This is basically what like modern
Yes.
archaeology is. So yeah, I don't. Yeah, I would say it depends on the question you're asking, and it depends upon what you're looking at specifically, right?
Yeah.
We'd have to get in
So
particulars.
I you have the science, the scientists, and then you have the science, right? So
Yeah,
to the point about the scientists making ethical moral decisions, they're individuals,
yeah,
and individuals are a myriad of different awarenesses and modes of thinking, right?
right.
Whether they're taking their scientific position one day or doing this the other day or all simultaneously, that's one thing. So I agree that science itself doesn't properly have a way of talking about the moral and ethical implications, it's strictly speaking. And then, of course, also the uh, uh, the point about the historical. I think that even religion is informed by science on
Yeah,
occasion, if not on a regular basis.
and
There are
vice
plenty of
versa.
religious people out
Yeah,
there that are not
right.
creationists. And the fact the majority of religious people are not creationists, and that is in large part due to the scientific discovery or theory or whatever you would call it, that the Earth is much older
Right.
than the Bible or any other religious text predicted.
And can
Right.
I, I would also
So
say, sorry, 1 second. I would, you asked about ethics. I think ethics is a good one. Like, certainly there are certain individual, like you were saying, individual sciences are faced with certain applied ethical dilemmas. If we want to make the distinction between like ethics in general, like meta ethical theory, and applied ethics being what should we do in a particular situation, like ethical theory, like what are ideas of right and wrong. But I also think that science has something to say about that, because there's certain assumptions, let's say, there's certain ideals and values that are implicit within science that are inherently ethical in nature, such as, I would say, free inquiry, right? The the ability of the individual to research and to investigate whatever he or she wants to without external condemnation. I think that's a ethical value that science assumes and promotes. Perhaps even you can derive freedom of speech from that. You can derive freedom of religion from that, maybe even. I mean, yeah, it's a bit of a stretch, and I'll admit that, but I do think that there are certain values sort of implicit within it.
yeah, perhaps um, that would be a conversation for another time, I think.
Agreed.
I'm going to just, as a matter of course, agree with everything that Raymond said and nothing that you said.
Oh my God. I'm about to bang my head against the wall right now.
Oh gosh.
No, I mean, no, I mean, all good points on both. All good points, I think. So that's the reason why we have conversations, right?
Yeah.
So, so I think that will more or less do it for this week. Thank you for joining us on Front Porch Philosophers Podcast. I'm Thomas Jared Farmer.
I am Michael Granado.
And Raymond Perrier.
Thanks a lot. See you next time.
Peace.